Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on March 16th, 2026. Today we're very pleased to be joined for the first time on Reason to Resist by Helena Cobban. Helena is a British-American writer and researcher on international relations with special interests in West Asia, the international system and transitional justice. She is also the president of Just World Educational and the author of numerous very important books on the region, one of which is titled Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. Thank you so much for joining us today, Helena.
No, it's a pleasure to be with you, Dimitri. I love your show.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to begin with the question of Hamas's, I think, evident restraint during the course of this criminal war of aggression on Iran. Up until now, there hasn't been any visible large-scale military operation mounted by resistance forces either in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank, at least as far as I can tell. But in the last few days, an interesting video emerged of what I understand were the Al-Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, conducting a military parade in the Gaza Strip, and this is what it showed. So as you can see, Helena, that was conducted in broad daylight, reportedly well after the war of aggression on Iran began. Do you think this is a harbinger of things to come? Do you see any signs that the resistance, whether it be Hamas or some other resistance group within occupied Palestine, is about to become involved in this war?
No, I think what that was a show that we are still here. You know, that's the importance of that. They're hanging on. Like, I can't even begin to describe how terrible things are for people inside the, what is it, 47% of Gaza, in which the Israeli forces are still absent, you know? I mean, this ceasefire from last October was supposed to have led to ceasing of fire by both sides. Israel has continued to fire, has continued to kill people, upwards of, I think, 600 people since the so-called ceasefire. Israel was supposed to send in 600 trucks of vitally needed aid supplies every day. If they are lucky, the people in Gaza, the 2.1 million people in Gaza, get 200 trucks per day. So the fact that they are hanging on after the third winter in this genocidal war is significant. And I don't think we can hope for more than that. I would just note that evidently from that clip that you just showed, they are well organized. They have numerous numbers of fighters on the ground. And I just compare it with the number of fighters that were aired by the so-called Iranian opposition, Iranian Kurdish opposition, who got videotaped recently in eastern Iraq. And there were about 8 or 10 of these people who were supposed to overthrow the Iranian government. I think the fact that Qassam brigades was able to organize that in the daylight is a sign that actually a lot of the Israeli surveillance and attack capabilities that were focused on Gaza have been sent to Lebanon, where they are like just visiting this unspeakable destruction on the whole southern half of the country.
And what about civil society in occupied Palestine, Helena? Of course, whatever the organized resistance groups may or may not do, we might see, I imagine, some sort of an uprising, another intifada. Do you see any indications that that might happen?
Dimitri, they are just hanging on in the West Bank as in Gaza. You know, the fact that they can hang on in their homeland is itself a major victory. I don't think we should demand anything more than that.
And I don't mean to suggest that I'm demanding anything. My only interest is whether or not you see signs of something along those lines happening. But I completely agree, Helena. It's a miracle that the Palestinian people continue to subsist and demand their emancipation. Now, let me talk to you briefly about another resistance group in West Asia, and that being Ansarallah. Until now, interestingly, Ansarallah has not, at least in any visible way, entered the fray. But the member of the Ansarallah Political Bureau, who we've actually had the opportunity to interview on this show, Mohammed al-Bukaiti, stated that the decision has been taken by the Political Bureau to stand militarily alongside Iran, and the zero hour will be announced at the appropriate time. That statement was issued within the past few days. Do you believe, I'm interested in your thoughts about why they haven't entered until now, and whether you believe that that is imminent, and if so, what their participation in this war might look like.
So, you know, the late Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, had a very well-developed theory of strategic patience. And I'm not saying that Ansarallah are just, as they're described in the West, as proxies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but they clearly coordinate at many different levels. And I think they also, the Ansarallah, the Houthis, have a philosophy, an approach of strategic patience, and we have seen that definitely in the past. So, of course, their main lever of power is their ability to control the shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and especially given that the Islamic Republic of Iran is currently controlling very tightly the passage through the Strait of Hormuz. That makes the Bab el-Mandeb even more important. And of course, if you look at what is happening in the shipping business, regardless of what Mr. Bukheti or anybody else says, the people who insure those large tankers, you know, and that is a massive amount of money, massive amount of oil, massive amount of money. The insurers are not going to necessarily say, oh, well, that means it's fine for us to sail through the Bab el-Mandeb for the next, next few days until Ansarallah brings down the boom. I mean, they've already majorly affected shipping. So I think holding back some of the capabilities in a strategic way is something we have also seen the Islamic Republic of Iran doing. For example, apparently the missile attacks on Israel over the past couple of days have gotten very much more serious. Those are very capable hypersonic missiles that have been held back until now, because until now, the IRGC and the others were using much older and less capable missiles and drones, kind of ground-hugging drones, in order to deplete the stocks of interceptors, both in Israel and in the US bases throughout the region. And that's what we saw last June. They have a very disciplined and coordinated approach of holding back some of their, more devastating weapons and means of leverage, which the fact that they have done this, exercised this command and control, is itself a sign that the so-called mass decapitation event that the Israelis organized on February 28th has completely failed.
Right. I want to come back to that in a moment. I just want to stay focused on the Red Sea for 1 second and get your thoughts on this this odd announcement we saw from the U.S. military about the USS Gerald Ford in the last few days. So just to remind our audience, the USS Gerald Ford was ordered to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then reports emerged that its septic tanks and toilets were backed up. Apparently, it needed to enter on an urgent basis the U.S. naval base on the south of Crete, Suda Bay. Some kind of repair work was done there. Then it headed towards occupied Palestine. Then it was ordered to go into the Red Sea, and it passed through the Suez Canal. And 2 days ago, after not hearing about the USS Gerald Ford for several days, the U.S. military put out a statement that there had been a fire in the laundry room. And I'm not sure exactly where it is, but my best guess is it's in the North Red Sea, and it doesn't appear to be any rush to confront Ansarallah or to hazard a voyage through the southern Red Sea. What's your sense of what's going on there? What has happened to the USS Gerald Ford, Helena?
Well, one account that I read said that there are 680 toilets on the USS Gerald Ford, which gives you an idea of how many, fighters and people, seamen and, aircraft pilots, aircraft engineers, maintenance people. I mean, 680 toilets, like, let's say 8 people per toilet, whatever, I mean, if you've got 680 toilets backing up, that has to be disgusting. So, that's just one note. But yeah, an aircraft carrier is incredibly vulnerable on its own. It only ever sails with an accompanying strike group consisting of a number of guided missile destroyers and oil tankers and other things that it needs to survive. And I think it's quite likely that they don't want to go anywhere near Yemen. I mean, the north of the Red Sea, you have Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both of which are tightly tied into US-Israeli military planning. So that's relatively safe for them. No, I think they're wise not to go near the south.
So since we're on the subject of the vulnerability of these naval assets, I wanted to talk to you about the Strait of Hormuz. Over the past several days, we've witnessed the extraordinary spectacle of Donald Trump proclaiming that Iran is defeated while calling upon other NATO members to clear the Strait of Hormuz. And this was a report from The Guardian yesterday, or actually, I think this is today. Trump steps up pressure on European allies to help protect the Strait of Hormuz. And he's reported to have said that it's only appropriate for Europe to help, and he warned that the failure to do so would be very bad for NATO. Now, Helena, I've seen no indication so far that other NATO members will send their naval vessels into the Strait. But I've learned over time not to underestimate the subservience of European governments to Washington. I have 2 questions for you. Do you think that ultimately they will capitulate to this demand, particularly the threat against NATO that Trump is making? And whether or not they'll do that, whether or not they'll commit suicide by sending their naval forces into the Strait of Hormuz, to what degree do you think these governments, European governments, particularly the British government, are actually participating in this war?
Oh gosh, that's so many questions, Dimitri. Let me try and take them one at a time. So Trump's really crackpot declarations of yesterday included the preface to, it's appropriate that these other countries, come and help us clear the Strait of Hormuz. He prefaced that by saying, maybe we should have coordinated with them ahead of time. Like, duh, the US and Israel launched this war on February 28th out of the blue. Like, of course, they've been preparing for it for years and more intensively over the recent months. But, there was zero coordination with these other powers. Now, let's look at the other powers that he has claimed that he's invited to join. They include 4 countries that are very deeply subservient, as you said, to US global power. That is the UK, France, South Korea, and Japan. But he also said he wants to invite China. So, what kind of a crackpot idea is this? He is flailing very badly. The Chinese, of course, I'm sure your viewers know this, but the Chinese have played a very important behind-the-scenes role both in military tech terms and in diplomatic support terms for the Islamic Republic's war effort. And I think it's really important to understand this because, I grew up in England, a long time ago. It was like the Suez Affair. I was 4 years old. That was just around my 4th birthday in 1956 when the British worked. And it's important to this is a good precedent because on that occasion, the British and French worked hand in glove, or as they say in London, hand in fly, with the Israelis to launch an aggression against Egypt with the aim of toppling President Nasser. And at that point, it was the Americans, it was Eisenhower who stepped in and said, no, this is bad for the world. It's bad for, the United Nations, it's whatever. And he pulled the plug on the pound sterling and on the French franc, and he threatened to pull the plug on the ever vulnerable Israeli shekel. And overnight, well, not exactly overnight, but very speedily, the British, French withdrew from the portion of Egypt that they'd occupied. And then soon thereafter, the Israelis withdrew. So, that actually introduced a period in which the British, who had been essentially manning all the military bases along the southern coast of the Gulf. We're talking about the Persian/Arabian Gulf here. I think we should call it the Khalij to separate it from the Gulf of Mexico or whatever that other Gulf is called these days. But so the British had military bases, naval bases all along the south of the Khalij until 1956, and they kept them for a few years thereafter. But in 1967, the British Prime Minister said, we can't afford this. We just can't afford it. We're going to pull out. And then the Americans came in instead. And that happened, let's say, late 60s, early 1970s. So those bases along the southern coast of the Gulf have been American bases ever since. And we're talking about Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. A string of US military bases. Now, until 1979, they also had the north coast of the Gulf because they had the Shah, who was, he'd been imposed by the British and Americans in 1953. So it was the Gulf, the Khalij at that point was a sort of an American lake. And then you had the revolution of 1979, which transformed the entire North Coast. And the North Coast is really important because it controls the Strait of Hormuz. If you look at the map of Hormuz, I think it's important for people to understand that map. And if you have one, maybe you can pop it up. But so that is why the Americans have been essentially since 1979 determined to reverse what happened in 1979. And so have the Israelis. And so, that's kind of the backdrop, the 47-year backdrop to what we're seeing today. The Iranians this Islamic Republic of Iran has not been unalterably opposed to working with Washington. Oh, thank you. Yeah, look at that. So that entire north coast is Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz, I don't know if you're able to get in on that more, but basically the boats, the very large container ships and crude oil carriers, to get around that Strait of Hormuz, which is a very narrow shipping channel, they have to go very slowly because one of those large boats, you don't just it's not like a speedboat. You're not like vroom. You have to very carefully go around those bends. So they have roughly between 15 and 30 hours of extreme vulnerability to Iran. So that's how Iran is controlling that strait. And I'll come back to your original question, not a single one of those powers, including the US Navy, wants to try to shoot their way through the Strait of Hormuz right now. So there we are.
I just want to touch on, before I ask you for the second part of my question, sorry for bombarding you with all these questions at once, but I want to go back to something you said a moment ago about the important role China has been playing politically behind the scenes. As I'm sure you're aware, Helena, I haven't had an opportunity to review it in any detail on this program yet, but there was a disgraceful resolution by the UN Security Council recently, which condemned the victim of this aggression, Iran, and said nothing about the perpetrators of the aggression, at least did not condemn them, namely Israel and the United States. I don't know if I was surprised or not after, Russia and China abstained in relation to that even more disgraceful resolution approving the Board of Peace. But they abstained on this one too. Now, I could hazard a guess as to why they did that, but what is your sense as to why neither of them vetoed that dastardly resolution?
I think it's very similar to why they didn't veto the November 17th resolution that adopted the Board of Peace as a UN Security Council project. I mean, that was so outrageous back in November. At that time, I had a really good conversation with my friend, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, and he gave me a number of reasons, and people can go back to, my account of that on the Just World educational website. But among the reasons that he gave are that, China likes to it doesn't want to get out ahead of the Arab states. And back in November, the fact that even Algeria, which once was a beacon of the national liberation movements worldwide, and is a member of the UN Security Council, Algeria voted for that Board of Peace resolution. So on this occasion, I think there was probably something very analogous. I don't know about Algeria's position as such, but clearly a large majority of the Arab states were really upset with the war, and they were kind of driving things. So the Chinese, and to a lesser extent the Russians, but the Chinese are extremely diplomatically savvy, and they also they have a concept of strategic patience. I mean, all these ancient civilizations look at your country or mine, 250 years. What is that? That's like just a passing fancy, in terms of the history of the Chinese Middle Kingdom, or the 2,500 year history of Persia, Iran. So then you can have strategic patience. Meantime, the Chinese have been doing some really interesting things. They've been doing a lot of diplomacy. They have a special envoy whose name escapes me, but he has been in the region intensively talking with not only the Iranians, but also with all the major Gulf countries and with Jordan and with Israel. They have, decent working relations with Israel, which to me is an interesting factor, because it means that they can, actually credibly present themselves as capable of mediating an end to this conflict and displacing this whole idea that we've all become so accustomed to since 1973, that Washington is the place that mediates all the conflicts in West Asia. So that's one thing the Chinese have been doing. The foreign minister Wang Yi has made a number of phone calls to leaders in the region. And remember that China is just emerging right now from a very intense period of the Spring Festival, when everybody, it's like their kind of, Christmas, New Year's bash, when everybody goes home to their families and the ministries all kind of ramp down. But also something called the Two Sessions, which is a very major series of decision-making consultations at the national level. So they've been very busy in Beijing with their own stuff, but meantime, they've been, running this very interesting and potentially very constructive diplomacy in the region. That's one thing they've been doing. And the other is sharing their amazing satellite capabilities with Iran. And I followed this a little bit. Thank you. I'm glad you pulled that up. So, back in June, when the Israelis hit Iran on June 13th, they were capable of getting information about the location of key leaders by essentially hacking the phones of those leaders' bodyguards. The leaders themselves were smart enough, not to take their phones with them to the key meetings, but their bodyguards were communicating by just like regular GPS, linked phones, and the Israelis were able to hack that. But on that occasion, the Iranian military had started using Chinese satellite communications for the missile guidance. And that's why back in June, they were capable of hitting some very important Israeli military locations, which forced the Israelis and Washington into a ceasefire after 12 days back in June. So since June, the Iranians have been definitely upgrading their connection to the Chinese satellite networks and cutting off their connections with American satellite networks. I mean, you or I, we use GPS all the time and we think, it's just like politically neutral. It's not. It's all, subject to US Israeli hacking. Mm-hmm. So the Chinese system is called Beidou, and they've been using that a lot. And mm-hmm. Intriguingly, I found a poster on Twitter called Mizar Vision. Mizar is, I guess, one of the key stars in the Great Dipper. Mm-hmm. And so it's named after a star. And in the days, I want to say in the 4 or 5 days leading up to February 28th, Mizar Vision started releasing on Twitter a series of very detailed images of American military bases all across West Asia that were labeled in Chinese. I don't read Chinese. I wish I did sometime, but Arabic is enough for me. So labeled with, this is a KC-130 tanker. This is a F-35. And they put all that stuff onto Twitter, which I found fascinating. Like, why reveal your satellite capabilities? And then they did a few after February 28th to show the effects on, in particular, on American radar facilities across the region, which were some of the very early targets of the Iranian retaliation. So it was really interesting that they revealed this capability. And obviously, there's a huge portion of that satellite and satellite imaging analysis, the AI that goes behind it, that they have not revealed, that they presumably have been sharing with the Islamic Republic of Iran and with other allies in the region. So this is, this Beidou system cannot be hacked, cannot be spooked by the US and Israelis. Just on a little related note, I'd also note that a lot of these AI capabilities that the US and Israel have been relying on, including, in targeting and in coordinating all the, the overflights and this and that. That's all hosted by Amazon, what's it called? Amazon AWS, Amazon Web Services data data centers up and down the south coast of the Gulf. And those data centers in Bahrain and in the Emirates have also been targeted by the Iranians quite effectively, because we think of a data center as being something that is like, oh, it just gets my Amazon packages here delivered here on time or whatever. No, it's an integral part of the US-Israeli war plan.
Mm-hmm. I want to take you back to the second half of that big question I asked you, which is the level of European involvement, not just Europe, also Canada, where I'm currently situated. I want to show you a statement that was issued, a readout by the government of Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, as I like to call him, otherwise known as Mark Carney. He spoke to British Prime Minister Keir Starmer this morning, apparently. And their readout, I've seen numerous statements like this over the past 2 weeks coming out of the Canadian government, but they stated, following their participation in last week's G7 leaders virtual meeting, Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Starmer discussed the situation in the Middle East. They condemned the Iranian regime's missile and drone attacks, including on civilian and energy infrastructure, and expressed deep concern over the toll on civilians, the risk of further regional escalation, and the broader global economic consequences of the conflict, including rising energy prices. Now, there's not a word. In fact, the next sentence, I want to point this out as well. They reaffirmed their determination to maintain pressure on Russia to end its war of aggression against Ukraine. Not a word in this statement about the violation of the United Nations Charter by Israel and the United States when they attacked Iran this time, or the last time in June, or the killing of Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani at the end of Trump's first administration, the attack on the Iranian diplomatic mission in Damascus by Israel. I believe that was last year or the year before. Not a word about that. And the way this is phrased, it makes it sound like all of these problems, the energy infrastructure being blown up, the toll on civilians, all emanates from what they say is Iranian aggression. Now, when I see statements like this, I'm deeply suspicious about the extent of Western government involvement in this criminal war. And I watched recently, 2 nights ago, I think it was, an excellent segment of Richard Medhurst, where he showed footage of American bombers at a British military base loading up their weapons. And it was being done quite conspicuously, it seemed. So what do you think the reality here is of, and let's focus in particular on the British government, of the extent and nature of the British government's involvement in this war?
Good question. Keir Starmer is in a lot of trouble domestically for a lot of reasons. One of which is his attitude, his supine, just subservience to the Americans on this war. He did at the beginning, at the very beginning, try to say, well, we're not going to get involved. And then he suddenly changed his attitude and said, oh, it's a defensive war. It's a defensive war because the Iranians have been retaliating, but I want to underline, number one, yes, he's been involved from the beginning and desperately trying to cover his tracks because of the huge opposition to this among the British public. Just as he was involved in the genocide in Gaza all along through the help that he gave the Israelis from Akrotiri Air Force Base in Cyprus, which I think was one of the early targets of the Iranians in the current war. So he's in a lot of trouble. And he's desperately flailing around and trying to seem relevant, because the British used to rule that whole part of the world, Yeah. So there's a sort of a little bit of imperial nostalgia, let's say. But his prime ministership is in deep trouble because of what's happening domestically with the economy and because of the whole Peter Mandelson affair. I like to call this Israeli-U.S. war campaign Operation Epstein Fury, because there is definitely a Jeffrey Epstein underpinning to it, let's say, and Mandelson was a big part of that. So at a broader level, I want to say that of the countries that Trump so-called invited them to join an effort to clear the Strait of Hormuz, which of course is not going to happen. But it's interesting to note those countries, the UK, France, Japan, South Korea, China, all of them dependent to some extent on the passage of oil through the strait, in one way or another. And when we see the price of oil going up, I just looked at it on the Financial Times website. I think it's north of $102 for Brent crude right now, up from $60 at the beginning of the year, and no relief in sight. So who are the winners and losers from this? The losers are all the countries that are heavily dependent on oil imports. The winners are actually Canada and the US, which are not dependent on oil imports. So who's making out like bandits? I don't know much about the structure of your hydrocarbon industry there in Canada, but I know in our industry here in the United States, like the big US oil companies are making out like bandits with the rise in oil prices. It's the people at the pump, like Joe Schmo and his wife, Nancy, who have to go and fill up their car in order to drive to work or pick up their children from school. They are suffering. So, that is, it's kind of, but it's important to note the difference in the level of the suffering of these different countries. China, for example, has done such a lot over recent years to shift to renewables, and they've also actually shifted to mining some of their own coal, that they are less dependent on oil than they were, let's say 5 or 10 years ago. And they have that nice relationship with Russia where they can presumably get some oil from Russia. Mm-hmm. I think South Korea and Japan are extremely vulnerable. The other one that I was interested that Trump did not reach out to invite to join is India. India is hugely dependent on those oil supplies. So what is it? Why is Trump inviting China but not India? Mm-hmm. I think the answer is he doesn't have a clue what he's doing. He's flailing around, and he has, there are no adults in the room with him to point out, the strategic or, political or diplomatic or military implications of whatever he comes into his mind. He's told us that he authorized the Israelis to launch the war on February 28th because he had a feeling. And now he's saying that although he's won, he's not sure when to actually finish the war, but he will know when he has a feeling. I mean, for goodness sake, this guy is not serious. He's a very dangerous person to have in charge of the world's largest nuclear arsenal.
God help us all, Helena. That's all I can say. And that's not easy for an atheist like me to say. In any case, I want to, by the way, on this question of why he didn't invite India, I mean, who knows what goes on in the brain of the muddled brain of that individual. But I saw today a very compelling exchange in the Indian parliament between Narendra Modi, the prime minister, and an opposition politician who was just castigating him for kneeling before Washington. And at the same time, this opposition politician was paying homage to the slain Ayatollah Khamenei. I thought that was quite compelling. And I was gratified to see that there is within India itself serious pushback to the this disgraceful performance by Modi, going to the Knesset just before this war was launched. Apparently the Indian military notified the Israelis about the presence of this Iranian naval vessel in their waters. As we all know, we've covered on
that had been invited by the Indian Navy. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just stunning to see a great nation like India behave in such an abject, servile manner, in contrary to its own interests, I believe, in the face of Trump's bullying. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. I want to go back to, because I know I don't have too much more time with you, I want to go back to these bases on the Persian Gulf. And I'm going to preface my question by telling you about an interview I saw 2 nights ago, a wonderful discussion between former CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou and Joe Lauria of Consortium News. And Joe asked John whether he thought after this war is over, the U.S. military bases would remain. And let's put this map back up so people can see again, up in the upper left-hand corner, massive U.S. military presence in Kuwait. Then going down the southern coast of the Persian Gulf, there's Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE. And John, I was surprised with his answer to this question. He thought that they were just going to effectively, the Gulf autocracies, muddle through as they have done in the past, and that the bases would be rebuilt and the U.S. military would remain. And this got me thinking about, I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. I'm rather more skeptical about that, but this got me thinking about why these military forces are actually there. And the official version is they're there to protect, these countries from external threats, primarily Iran. But I think the main reason why they're there is to protect these regimes from internal threats, which is to say the democratic aspirations of their own people, and to make sure that no matter what the domestic political situation is, the oil will remain firmly in control of the United States government. Why do you think these forces are there, and what do you foresee in terms of their presence once the dust has settled on this heinous war?
Great question, because I've been writing about this quite a lot over the past couple of weeks, and I have a proposal that I'm urging everybody to really examine, which is that we should push for the whole of the Khalij, the Gulf, to be established as a zone of peace with no external military forces having bases there at all, and that all the states that border the Gulf, the littoral states, and just looking at your map, you can see that Iran is the big one there, but all the other, Saudi Arabia is a big state. They can work together. They've proven in the past that they can work together. Back in March of 2023, actually, this Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, made a very interesting trip to Saudi Arabia and effected a reconciliation between the Saudis and the government of Iran. I mean, the Chinese are the ones who are capable of building this zone of peace, and it involves the exit of all. It's not that you're going to have Chinese bases there. That's the last thing the Chinese want. They want the peoples of the region, of the Khalij, to get along with each other and sort it out amongst themselves. To me, one of the precedents that I have here is what happened at Helsinki in 1974 in the waning years. Well, it wasn't the waning years. It was 2/3 of the way through the US-Soviet Cold War, when you had an arrangement at Helsinki whereby the nations of Europe would cooperate on a number of different projects. And they started to, and that provided a context in which they could start to de-escalate the military confrontation. I mentioned earlier that this whole south coast of the Khalij used to be British, and then in the early 1970s, the British were replaced by the Americans. So it was still what I call white supremacy international, doing its thing there.
Mhm.
It's time for it to leave. Let the states of the region deal with each other, which they have done. You know, a lot of the mainstream media seems to portray things as, you know, these are like centuries old conflicts and they will never get along with each other. They got along with each other just fine, you know, with some internal disagreements before white imperialism came there in the early 16th century. So
Mhm.
let's just get rid of the white imperialism. Now, I know this is particularly challenging for Saudi Arabia and many of the other Arab states of the Gulf, to be able to think of becoming part of their region that is not reliant on US and Israeli power. But
Mhm.
we have to note that it's not just the US military that is active in these bases. The US military is joined at the hip to the Israeli military and has been since the first Trump administration. I wrote about this recently on my site, globalities.org. So one of the big things that happened in the first Trump administration was that US military relations with Israel got shifted from being handled by the US military's European command to being handled by what they call CENTCOM, the Central Command, which is weird. Why do they call it Central Command when what it deals with is West Asia? Nothing to do. Anyway, but so at that point, the Israeli military has been, since that point, and that was, I guess, 2020, something like that, the Israeli military has been deeply embedded in all these states of the south coast of the Khalij. And you ask, you know, what did these people think they were, what did these monarchs and emirs and this and that think they were getting out of it? They thought they were getting protection from Iran and from their own people. I mean,
Mhm.
there is a sort of a religious sectarian issue here because a lot of the people on that east coast of Saudi Arabia are Shiite Muslims. And a lot of people in Kuwait are Shiite Muslims. So, you know, they have religious and cultural links with Iran.
Mhm.
The vast majority of the people on the island of Bahrain are Shiites, but they're ruled by this very corrupt little British installed Muslim, Sunni Muslim ruler. So, you know, these people can all get along, but they have to cut their links with the US Israeli war machine. And that is a huge project, obviously. There are some indications that many of the rulers in the Gulf are seriously considering this. And I wrote about that in my piece on globalities also. But it's a geopolitical shift of massive proportions if the southern coast of the Gulf stops being an outpost of white supremacy international.
Yeah. And whatever the Gulf autocracies may or may not wish in the end, the U.S. military is going to have to assess whether these bases are defensible in light of this war. And they may want to at least withdraw them, if not vacate the region altogether, purely for practical reasons. But that's another question. I want to conclude our discussion. I know you only have a few minutes left, Helena, where we began with occupied Palestine. And as I'm sure you know, the Iranian government has issued its demands for ending this war. They include reparations, security guarantees that they won't be attacked again, and also with the withdrawal from the U.S. military forces from the region. And some people have commented, pro-Palestinian voices in the commentariat, that none of the demands explicitly pertains to the liberation of the Palestinian people. Again, this has caused me to reflect on what's likely to transpire and what's really going on. And from my perspective, if in fact their demand that U.S. military forces withdraw is met, it's going to be much harder for Israel to brutally oppress the Palestinian people. Maybe they'll get away with it, maybe they won't, but I think that's going to be a much more dicey proposition. What do you think is the responsibility of the Islamic Republic of Iran in this regard? Should they be making demands relating to the liberation of the Palestinian people? Can they do that? Do you think that their primary responsibility is to protect their own nation? What's your view about what can and should be done by Iran at this point to help the Palestinians?
I think the primary responsibility of the government of Iran is to defend their people, and that involves hitting Israel, which is happening and is going to happen more and more over the days ahead. And hitting Israel has massive implications throughout the whole region. The Iranians are not going to liberate Palestine on behalf of the Palestinians, but once the Israeli military tech complex has been seriously damaged, if not nearly totally disabled by Iranian attacks, then we're talking about a whole new region. We're talking about, I think, in as much as China will be a major player in the diplomacy that follows, their position is steadfastly for a full implementation of all UN resolutions. Now, we can discuss whether UN resolution, whatever it was, of 1947 that divided historic Palestine is something that should be upheld. But if you could get full implementation of the resolutions from 1967, 1973, and since, for a complete withdrawal of the Israeli settler entity back to the pre-1967 borders, and also national liberation for the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza, then that is an amazing outcome that can be fought for in the context of the disablement of Israel's military tech genocide machine. So, yeah, I mean, these things are all obviously very closely connected, and I just see that my watch is telling me I need to go.
Okay. Thank you so much. I very much hope we can continue the conversation in future, Helena. And before you go, if you want to tell us about your most important books or where people can find your work, please do that.
Okay, yeah, well, this is the book that I published recently with Rami Khouri. It's called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. And I urge people to go to our website, www.justworldeducational.org, and to my personal writing platform, which is called Globalities, in the plural.org. So thanks for having me, Dimitri. I hope to come back soon. Sorry, I got to run.
No problem. We're signing off now for Reason to Resist.